Okay, I'm Genevieve, and before I begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this presentation takes place, the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Okay, so my key thinker is Nawal El Saadawi. Saadawi is a novelist, doctor, and human rights activist who uses her skills and influence to advocate for women's rights, especially in her home country of Egypt. Saadawi was born in 1931 in a poor village along the Nile, and during her life contested issues such as forced underage marriage, genital mutilation, and the lack of women in position of power. In response to her activism, the Egyptian state banned Saadawi's books, fired her from her position in the Ministry of Health, and in 1981 she was even imprisoned. However, Saadawi did not let her prison stay restrict her. She apparently used an eyebrow pencil and toilet paper to write memoirs from the women's prison, which was published in 1983. In 1992, she immigrated to America after a religious fundamentalist group in Egypt put her name in a death list. In America, Saadawi became an honorary professor at Duke University, but later returned to Egypt feeling she had more she wanted to do back home. Considering that Saadawi doesn't specifically address conservation, her ideas have an interesting influence on the field. During a writers' meeting in 2014, Saadawi stated that she is opposed to anything that divides us. The differences between people and cultures that literature erases, theory generalizes and abstracts. As conservators, we deal with the tangible and intangible heritage of a culture, the history and experiences that bring people together. Like Saadawi, our writing should not erase culture, but celebrate it. Our training and academic theories should never overpower the values of non-Western authorities. As conservation students, we are also encouraged to publish, attend conferences, and educate people about the field. Saadawi did something similar in her literary works. One of her earliest novels, Memoirs of a Woman Doctor, records the state of poverty her female patients lived in during her years as a psychiatrist. Presenting this real experience in a fictional novel universalized the struggles of Egyptian women to a wide audience. When we present at forums, create podcasts, and publish our essays, we should adopt Saadawi's skill of using her writing as a form of advocacy. Saadawi argues that the oppression of women is enacted by social imbalance and class structures, which aligns with theories of gendered cultural heritage. There has almost universally been a historical bias to celebrate the accomplishments, experiences, and material culture of men. For example, a weapon may be considered more valuable than a kitchen pot, two material objects with traditional ideas associated with a particular sex. In Colella's report, Smith argues that there has been an absence of women's history and sites in records of preserved heritage. The solution is to add women's perspectives to the historical record. Saadawi's novels primarily focus on the difficulties facing women, noting that they can be different to those of men. Like Saadawi, we have a responsibility to feature the female experience in our conservation work, to seek out art created by women and treat it with equal respect. Smith also acknowledges that workplace cultures in conservation have been governed by masculine practices and values. When looking into potential companies for employment, I noted that while there were far more women than men employed, leadership roles were primarily male. We also have a primarily female cohort, and so the imbalance between the sexes in conservation feels particularly relevant. Saadawi would suggest that in conservation workplaces, we should question their practices to ensure they are providing an environment of equality. Saadawi further suggests that misogyny in all contemporary societies is a result of class and sex power dynamics, not religion. In fact, Saadawi argues that the Western tradition of blaming Islam can actually exacerbate the problem for Arabic women. When people of influence overlook the economic and political roots of female oppression, they simultaneously overlook the part they play. Foreign exploitation of resources and a record of ignoring the opinions of Islamic women have furthered the gender divide. For Saadawi, female emancipation is closely linked to the struggle for national freedom against foreign powers, and although feminist movements from the West may be led with good intentions, they can hold back progress in places such as Asia and Africa. I raise this for two reasons. Firstly, I have found it repeated in many texts about and by Saadawi, so it is an issue very close to her. Secondly, as conservators, we have the ability to work all over the world, and with that comes the question about whether we should. Saadawi warns that past experiences of Arabic people answering to Western interests have restricted progress and freedoms for women in particular. As such, when we work with cultural materials from other countries and religious groups, we should keep in mind that it is not necessarily our interests we are trying to meet. We should always understand the context of a material, but not attempt to change it. For example, Saadawi and the Arab Women's Solidarity Group have frequently opposed the enforced wearing of a veil for women. If we were to conserve such a veil, we should understand the political and social context in which it exists, but according to Saadawi, as Western conservators, not try to alter it. Although primarily known as a gender theorist, as you've seen, Saadawi's comments on the interaction between Western and non-Western cultures are particularly relevant to conservation. In the Nawal El Saadawi reader, in a chapter titled "Why Keep Asking Me About My Identity?", Saadawi questions the ethics of discussing non-Western identity at conferences, organised, funded, and located in Western territories such as Europe and North America. Saadawi remarks that every time I come to a conference dealing with African identity or culture, why does no one ask what your identity is? There is a distinct lack of evidence of events discussing Western identities in Africa or Asia. Identity politics have traditionally been used as a tool of the powerful against peoples in post-colonial civilizations. When teaching at Duke University, Saadawi notes feeling like a second-class professor, where American educators had the intellect to explain theory, and Saadawi and other non-Western professors' theories and knowledge were considered alternative. We are training in a Western institution, but as conservators will interact with multiple communities with their own conservation practices. These conservation techniques are as valuable as those we will learn and should be respected as much. We will not always be the most informed authority on how to deal with an object, and, as Saadawi recommends, we must embrace expertise from various authorities, sometimes not academic. This idea also reflects the two-way learning we have frequently discussed, that when we go into communities, we teach and help each other, rather than encourage a relationship where we conserve what we can and then leave. Saadawi has always fought for a voice for those who have previously been denied. As conservators, we should use our skills and opportunity to do the same, rather than advance a history of oppression. In this presentation, I have taken the ideas and values of Nawal El Saadawi and applied them to issues in conservation. If she were to address conservation, I suggest she would promote writing as a method of advocacy, suggest using conservation to address the gender imbalance in the cultural record, and warn against enforcing Western ideals. Perhaps most of all, remind us that despite our training in this course, we will not always be the authority of the best conservation practices for a particular piece of cultural heritage. One of the opportunities conservation provides is that the more work we do, the more we can learn from other cultures and peoples. What Saadawi would emphasize is that in doing so, we should help empower minority groups instead of oppress them. Nawal El Saadawi has been a fascinating thinker to study. Before this presentation, I had never heard of her before, and if you have, I would be very interested in hearing your thoughts. Thank you for listening, and thank you for bearing with me while I attempt to use this technology.